Welcome to r/Credit by Haunted TTS. Subscribe and like this video for more, and don't forget to click that bell button for notifications. Forensics and people involved with managing the deceased. What's the weirdest cause of death you have come across? At a sad one, where a guy tried to hang himself from the third-floor balcony. The rope broke, and he fell and impaled himself on fence spikes. A lady walking her dog hours later thought he was a gruesome Halloween decoration until she noticed leakage from the poor guy. Security camera footage from across the street showed he was alive for a while, before he bled out. Paramedic here. I once worked a day in a seaside community where there was a bad winter storm. Due to its location, it was quite bad compared to most places. I'm talking minus 30 degrees centigrade, 100 plus kilometers per hour winds, extreme amount of ice in the ocean and lots of snow. This day I was doing the dispatch and also responding to calls. I get a phone call that there was someone found frozen on the front step. We rush down there and find a 50-ish-year-old lady sitting on her front step by her door completely frozen solid. She lived in the last house on a road that was right next to the ocean. I remember how windy and cold it was. In healthcare, there is a saying that you aren't dead until you're warm and dead. But this lady was clearly frozen solid. It was hard to examine her on the step due to the high wind and snow. I remember her key was in the deadbolt. It was open, but the door wouldn't budge. I had to use all of my weight to get it to open, and when it did, a bunch of ice fell from the edges of the door. I pick her up to move her in, and her body doesn't flex at all. Holding her up, she was in the exact same position as she was on the step. Her daughter showed up at this point and explained that she was at the neighbors the night before for dinner and left around 8 p.m. We got the call for her around 7:30 a.m. the next morning. While examining her, I found a bottle of nitro clenched in her fist. Her daughter mentioned she had angina and used it a lot. I was assuming she couldn't get the door open and started having chest pain and sat down. We were told the autopsy results and it was confirmed she died of a heart attack. I worked as a medical examiner transporter a few years ago and I saw lots of crazy stuff. One of the calls I went on was definitely strange. While the cause of death was suicide by hanging, the context of the scene was bizarre. He was a younger guy, maybe in his mid to late 20s, and he had been living in an older couple's shed in their backyard. They claimed not to have known him, but it allowed him to live there. Inside was evidence of some pretty severe mental problems. The guy had scribbled all over the inner walls of the shed with what seemed like anything he could find: pencils, charcoal, permanent markers, crayons, etc. He had hanged himself directly in the middle of the shed, and all around him were little messages and things. One said something along the lines of, "They're outside," and another said something like, "They'll be here soon." The most bizarre message, that my partner couldn't make heads or tails of, was written right above his little cot in the back. It stood out because it was written in some of the largest font and it just said, "Why is Greg here?" I'd been on calls for suicides and the like before, and many of them had been significantly worse, but this one really stood out to me. The cause of death wasn't super weird, but the entire scene was. I sometimes have to receive bodies late at night that the police bring in. The weirdest one I have had was a guy who was living in his ex-wife's garage without her knowledge. She never went in there, except for when a scrap metal merchant knocked on her door asking if she had anything for him. She suggested they try the garage, where they discovered a rank smell and a decomposing corpse wrapped in blankets. She was initially a suspect, but it turns out that he had been suffering from cancer and had died of cancer whilst wrapped in the sheets. We also had a little girl a couple of weeks ago who swallowed a battery from a remote control and died when the acid burned through her stomach and caused internal bleeding. Not a forensics person, but the girl that went to my primary school went to warm her car up in the winter and after starting it slipped on some ice and knocked herself out. She landed adjacent to the tailpipe DND expired due to carbon monoxide poisoning. Radiation sickness in an amateur scientist that had been performing ill-advised experiments. Tests had to be conducted to determine if the cadaver itself was even safe to handle. It's not something I expect to see again, but then, I said the same thing the first time I saw someone who got crushed under a tractor, but that is evidently just more common than I expected. A teaching case. Death by bull. A woman was found dead in a pasture, trampled by a bull. Well, if you underestimate cattle, that can happen. But she was the farmer's wife, so she knew the animal was aggressive, and everyone else in the village knew that too. The neighbors also said he was never kept in that pasture because you couldn't see all of it at once. Yep, the farmer murdered his wife with a bull as the weapon. Put him in the pasture without her knowing, then sent her out there for some errand. I'm a paramedic. One of the ones that sticks out in my mind. Get called by a man to do a wellness check in his sister. He lived on the lower floor of a house. Her the upper. He was wheelchair bound and she was his caretaker. She hadn't come downstairs that morning and he was worried because he heard a thud that night. Didn't think anything of it until she didn't show up in the AM. So we go up the stairs. I see little drops of blood on the stairs. More on the hall floor. We follow them. Find the bathroom. Blood everywhere. Blood all in the bathtub. Toilet is full of blood. Huge clots on the floor. Bloody handprints all over. Blood in the sink. We go looking for her. Find her, on the floor, between the bed and the wall, telephone next to her. Clearly, she was trying to call for help. She was white as a ghost. Usually, a dead person will be blue or purple and mottled. She didn't even have enough blood left for that. I'm guessing it was ruptured esophageal varices, but it was never confirmed. We checked for blood in her mouth and her butt, but there wasn't much. She had no trauma. We didn't find any booze, but you never know. One of my university professors was involved in a case where an otherwise healthy 40-year-old female had died, let's say instantaneously. I'll explain. Woman was like a CrossFitter marathon type, went out boating with her husband, boat capsized pretty far off the shore of the Atlantic, and they both ended up holding on to emergency floaties drifting in the ocean, no life jackets, for a few hours. Now, it wasn't the winter obviously, but for whatever reason seas in the water was pretty cold, so hypothermia was a concern. Coast Guard sent a helicopter to pick them up. I don't know why they didn't send a boat, and they strapped the husband up and bring him into the chopper. He's fine. They put the woman on the board, and in the time it takes to get her pulled up into the chopper she dies, when moments before she had been completely lucid and in great spirits. They'd only been out there for a couple hours, so it wasn't dehydration or starvation, or really anything they could think of. Woman was in great shape, and they suspected the hypothermia hadn't progressed enough to be lethal. Basically, as my prof explained it, since her entire lower half, from the chest down, was submerged in the cool water, it would have cooled down, not just the tissue, but the blood in most of her body, especially since some would have started pooling in her legs after a few hours. This would have been fine if she remained vertical, but when rescuers put her horizontal, the chilled blood fast-tracked into her heart, causing cardiac arrest. He said it's odd that it happened to this specific lady, but that it was a significant death, whereas it's happened before, but they've been able to save the person. So apparently he said they keep you sitting up now until they're able to warm your legs back up to reduce the chances of this happening. First responder. I've been to multiple suicides where the person had to shoot themselves more than once in the head. One guy was still alive for about 15 minutes after we got there, but there was no saving him. So I'm a forensic toxicologist. I usually don't work with dead bodies directly, crime scenes excepting, but I do test blood, urine, etc. for alcohol and other drugs. When we get the blood of someone who is dead, the case file will often list a brief cause of death. I have a few favorites. The man who got very drunk somehow managed to get his four-wheeler onto his roof and then proceeded to launch himself off. Darwin took over after that. The person who died while asleep after a small airplane crashed into their bedroom. This one isn't mine, but a professor I had once received a blood sample from a blind stick. No, bad, that was pretty much pure booze from a ruptured stomach. Not testing that. We had a family friend who was an alcoholic who blacked out and died of asphyxiation. Official cause of death was unconsciousness, forced victim into a position incompatible with life. When clarification was sought, they said she passed out and fell into a position that prevented her from breathing. I did not know that was possible. I work in forensics from an engineering and product design aspect. A man was using a large handheld wet saw, imagine an oversized circular saw, to cut a 3-diameter concrete sewer pipe that was suspended using 2 sawhorses. When he finished the cut, the pipe fell and pinched the saw blade between the 2 pieces, causing the saw to flip around quickly and sever off his own head. Not quite what the question is asking, but I've worked for a 911 center. A little while back, officers got called to check the well-being of a woman who hadn't been to work in 3 days. They arrive, find an overweight female down on the ground, discolored and without a pulse, surrounded by squalid living conditions and a pet cat wandering her apartment. Officers call in asking for an ambulance to their location, no need for lights and siren. I put in the call to fire dispatch, and they let me know by policy we have to go lights and siren anyway. I advise the officers and continue with my other work. About 15 minutes later, fire dispatch yells over to me. Apparently the woman had a diabetic episode and had a heart rate of 20 BPM when the ambulance arrived, which is why officers didn't find the pulse when they checked. EMS took her to the hospital right away and she survived. I can only hope she wasn't conscious much of the 3 days she spent sitting in her own filth. Or the half hour that police officers wandered around her before calling for medical assistance. Oof. I'm sorry for this, and I expected to get buried, but in high school I took a human physiology course my senior year, and as a field trip we went along with the forensics class to observe a cadaver. The cadaver we saw was of an 80-year-old male. The cause of death was not given for privacy reasons, but my guess would be some kind of strange organ failure. The man's lungs were speckled a bit as he had been a smoker, but most of his liver was missing and part of a kidney looked as if it had just lost all its mass. His stomach was oddly wrinkled and warty like a toad, and he appeared to have several broken ribs that were healing. I still wonder if the man died of old age or something weirder. Security called to do a welfare check on an elderly resident at a retirement community. Person didn't answer the door, so they made entry and found the person stuck between the couch and chair in their living room. Moved the chair and moved the person to the floor. Obviously deceased, but had this odd yellowish foam around the mouth. After looking further, discovered a plastic bag that was wedged behind the couch with the same foam on it. Person fell and got wedged between two pieces of furniture, but face landed on or near a plastic bag, so basically suffocated. The person was eaten alive through maggots growing through his amputated leg. Not a forensic person, but a friend of mine went drinking at a bar. He got pissed drunk and the bartender rightfully took his motorcycle keys away. He lived just a few blocks away. When the bar closed, he stumbled toward home, fell in a ditch and drowned in the inch of water that was in that ditch from the rain that came down. Not in forensics, but in healthcare. Saw a guy that got so high he decided to go into the freezer and start eating a bunch of frozen raw chicken. Ended up dying choking on it. Someone in my family is a medical examiner and they told me about a case they got called to where a dementia patient choked on some marshmallows. Obviously dementia patients are not supposed to have these kinds of foods since they constitute a choking hazard, but the old lady saw a nurse eating a bag of them. So she sneaked up behind and snatched the marshmallows from the nurse. She started racing away in her wheelchair with one hand on the wheel shoving marshmallows into her mouth with the other. Of course it was all too much and she started to choke as she was booking it down the hall and it was too late by the time they caught up to her. The poor old lady chubby bunnied herself to death. I'm not a paramedic or forensic specialist, but in my early 20s I was a crime scene cleaner. It was mostly self-harm and we only dealt with the aftermath of the ordeal. Still saw lots of crazy stuff though. One of the most memorable was a death in the greater Phoenix area. We were called in to clean out a home of what I remember to be a natural death. We walked into the kitchen and saw a rather large high chair, but didn't really think anything of it. Made our way to the bedroom and found a full-on man-sized crib and changing table. We destroyed all of it at the family's request so that none of it ends up on eBay. He seemed to be loved by the community with candles lit in driveway and chalk drawings of "We will miss you baby man." This is all a little off topic, but it was an interesting experience to say the least. Paramedic here. Had a few. Homeless guy climbs into a recycling clothes bin to retrieve warm jackets in the winter and it had one of those barrel-type drawers. He got stuck by his head on the way out and was strangled. Weirdest thing was walking up to him across a supermarket car park and he was just looking up at the sky, but with a frost-covered face. Also had somebody die in front of a warm electric fire and wasn't found for 2 days. The guy was cooked like a roast chicken. My friend is a pathologist, couldn't work out why a 40-year-old male had died. Finally dissected the trachea and found he'd inhaled an entire frankfurter. Was alone in house at the time of death. I'm an autopsy doctor and early in my training one of the cases was a young person found dead at an airport gate. Yup, drugs stuffed up the butt that must have ruptured. Apparently it's not uncommon, it's one of the things to look for in unexpected travel deaths. My great-great-grandmother died after being cut nearly in half by a lumber saw in the 1930s. She was wearing a scarf or something when she took her son, my great-grandfather, some lunch and her scarf became caught on the saw and pulled her down. They turned off the saw quickly enough and she lived for a while afterwards, a while here meaning hours or days, I can't recall, but less than a week. My understanding is she walked to the car that drove her to the hospital, but there was obviously nothing they could do for her. Obligatory not involved with forensics or anything, but I have a story my mom told me and she was told this by her driving instructor and a colleague who both apparently witnessed it firsthand. While the colleague was taking driving lesson with the instructor, a motorcycle driver passed her and the truck before her. While passing the truck, the motorcycle driver's head suddenly flew off of his body. The truck had some very thin steel plates loaded, one of them wasn't properly secured and stood out at the side of the truck, and because it was so thin neither the colleague and instructor nor the motorcycle driver could see the plate. Sorry if my English is weird. It's not my native language and I'm not sure if all words are correct.